final portion of the program is Larry Gunderson. I first became acquainted with Larry when he was working with the Brown Nicollet Water Program, and he moved on, moved up, moved forward. He's now the Minnesota River Basin Coordinator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and he leads the Minnesota River Turbidity TMDL project. And in that role, he develops pollutant reduction strategies for surface water and works with people in the Minnesota River Basin on river cleanup activities. His topic, addressing the turbidity in the Minnesota River, and it does focus on what we're doing and how can we move forward in improving the water quality. Larry, welcome.
Thanks, Will. Nice to see you here again. And this morning we talked a little about shear stress. And if you have a lot of shear stress in the water, it carries sediment particles. We saw that equation this morning. And if there's not enough shear stress, the sediment doesn't move. I guess I didn't first learn about shear stress with the equation. I learned about it the hard way. In the early 1990s, I was out in Yellowstone National Park in the Mammoth Hot Springs, north end of the park. And at least at that time, I don't know if you can still do it, but you can get in the hot spring. You take your clothes off, get in your swimsuit, and jump in the hot spring. And I got hot in the hot spring, so I moved a little bit too close to the river, and the river took me about 10 feet downstream, and that was the longest 5 seconds of my life. So I figured that's kind of like shear stress. As far as a little bit about my background, it was Friday the 13th in July 1984. My mom told me my dad was in the hospital. He was the ag teacher at the high school in Ada, and he had some chest pains. He was getting some FFA plots ready for the summer, and I ended up going to the hospital. And a few days after that, we learned he'd had a heart attack, and subsequently he had heart surgery. And it was that day I remember very well that I realized how important family is to me. And my wife and I, we live in Vadnais Heights, just north of St. Paul. We've got 2 daughters, ages 5, and tomorrow my older daughter will be 9. In that small town of about 1,500 people, I got to know a lot of the rural families through relationships with my parents, had with them, and my involvement in FFA and 4-H. My graduating class was 45 people, and it's unimaginable to my friends in the Twin Cities today when the class sizes are 200 and above. I spent a lot of my summers working out at our farm, and then also with friends and neighbors. My dad has the quarter section of our relatives homesteaded in the 1870s. Some look back with romanticism and nostalgia about living back then. I can't imagine living in the woods in a sod hut with the mosquitoes back during those times. After the college at the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus, as Will said, I worked for the Brown Nicollet and Cottonwood Water Quality Board, and one of my first tasks there was to interview 40 farmers on their best management practices. And as I did that, I developed relationships with those people and learned a lot from them, and the education certainly went both ways. I was involved in promoting nitrogen best management practices to both urban and residents and farmers. So what I'll cover today is some of the upstream and downstream water issues, a little bit on the sediment sources, but we've certainly heard a lot about that already. Then a little bit on the Minnesota River Turbidity TMDL, and then I think the most important thing I have to say today is probably toward the end, and that's about working together. So this slide shows the upper 2 pictures are Rice Creek and the Cobb River, and they're in the Le Sueur River watershed. And we've often heard a lot about the Minnesota River or Lake Pepin or even the Gulf of Mexico. And I guess what I want to stress here is that for the MPCA, it's about beneficial uses and water quality standards and achieving those beneficial uses. So, for example, aquatic life and recreation. And often we focus maybe on Lake Pepin, and that's where the conversations are. Maybe that's where the newspaper articles are at. But these local tributaries that are next to your houses and in your backyards are just as important as those downstream waters, and I don't want to lose sight of that. And of course, the bottom pictures here are the Le Sueur River and the Minnesota River at Judson. This morning, Dr. Fox talked a little bit about the channel evolution model and how the rivers can downcut and widen, and the sediment sources or the cutting can occur at the toes of the bluffs, and we heard about seepage and sediment coming from banks and also freezing and thawing. And I think those are I know people have been working with those a long time, that information, that research, but I think as a community that's kind of becoming new information to a lot of us. Now, the bluffs that we talked about are certainly large sources of sediment in the Minnesota River Basin and, for example, at the Le Sueur watershed scale. But as we move up in these watersheds, and I'm almost afraid to push a button here, as we move up in these watersheds, those proportions change. So obviously if the bluffs are closer to the mouth of the Le Sueur River, as we move up and away from those bluffs, the sediment sources tend to be more stream banks or uplands. And the BMPs that you're putting on your fields, that's a good thing. Now obviously there's a lot lower sediment level in these streams up here than there are at the mouth of the Minnesota River, but in the case of Le Sueur, these reaches still don't meet water quality standards. So as we get into Freeborn County or near Winnebago, those reaches are still impaired and not meeting water quality standards. Sure, fixing those rivers may not have a big impact on Lake Pepin, but locally they will. And the work that you've been doing to put those practices on your land has been helping those upland waters for a long time, and that's a good thing. So turbidity in the Minnesota River Basin. This map shows the reaches of the Minnesota River Basin that are impaired for turbidity, and this is just the main stem of the Minnesota River and the lower reaches of the tributaries. There are 18 impairments, there are 18 reaches, stream segments that are not meeting water quality standards, and you can see those here on the map. And sometimes people ask me, well, why is the Minnesota River impaired in some areas but not in others? Does it clean up right away and it's more full of sediment later downstream? And my answer is that probably most of the Minnesota River main stem is impaired. It's just that we don't have the data to list it all. So that's why you see some of these blue reaches, and then the maroon reaches, of course, that are the impaired ones. The impairments we see at this scale tend to be on the lower reaches of the tributaries in addition to the main stem. And a TMDL, or total maximum daily load, is a tool. It goes back to the Federal Clean Water Act, and it's established to achieve beneficial uses and water quality standards. Sure, you probably won't see a boat or a swimmer maybe in a tributary by your house, but those reaches are still important for spawning and other aquatic life like mussels or stoneflies or other organisms. I've only got two graphs here, and they're pretty much the same, so I won't march you through a lot of more technical information, but this one is what's called a low duration curve, and the concept here is that on the right-hand side of the graph are very low flow conditions, and on the left-hand on the bottom here, very high flow conditions. And on the up and down y-axis here are the total suspended solids loads, the tons of sediment. And this line here from upper right or upper left to lower right represents the target or water quality standard, or something very similar to the water quality standard. And this next slide is pretty much that same graphic, but it just shows the data points for the Le Sueur. So if we're out there monitoring, or the county or the Soil and Water Conservation District or an organization is out there monitoring, these data points are what they've collected. And I wanted to show this graphic mainly for one reason, and that's that we can see when in this case, the Le Sueur River is not meeting water quality standards. Sometimes people say, well, yeah, it's the Minnesota River, Le Sueur River, it's always in bad condition. But in this case, on the right-hand side of this graphic, these points are below the green line, which means we're meeting water quality standards during low flow conditions. So the BMPs out there and the lack of precipitation help to get that river to meet those standards. And then, of course, as we get into these medium flow and certainly the high flow conditions, that's where we're not meeting water quality standards. Now, I guess it shouldn't be surprising to anybody in this room that right now I looked and we're in this high flow area, a very high flow area. I was kind of curious last week before I came here, and it's just interesting to look at the different stream gauges on the Minnesota River and its tributaries to see how high the flows really are. So certainly we're in this blue area right now. So as part of this Minnesota River water quality project, we worked with a group of stakeholders, a group of people that have a stake in improving the Minnesota River. And they included the sectors listed on this slide, and NGOs, non-government organization. And agriculture was well represented and was well represented at all the meetings. And this next slide shows some of the implementation type practices that the group came up with. And we used a couple of ways to develop these. One was to get input from the people in the group and then use that information in a water quality model. Now I need to say that these are example practices. There's probably other things in each of these categories that can be done, and I just put these down to provide examples. But you can see here the first two. One is crop residue, something that's been done for a long time on land. That could be also buffer strips or grassed waterways could be represented there. Stormwater, certainly urban best management practices to infiltrate and store water, especially in the larger communities with all the impervious surfaces are important. Perennial vegetation at the watershed mouths. Ravine BMPs, keeping the water out of the ravine or trying to keep those ravines from getting longer or wider. And I guess the comment there too is as I've looked more into this, I thought that ravines would be a big contributor, but as some of the studies have come out, they're not as big at the watershed scale as one would have thought. And I think, and I don't have any data to back this up, but I asked a colleague at the Board of Water and Soil Resources to show me a map of the Le Sueur River watershed, and I was surprised to see how many water and sediment control basins are at the tips of these ravines. So that's a good thing, and maybe a reason they're not getting a lot longer and wider. As a matter of fact, one group that's studying the Le Sueur River compared air photos from the 1930s to the 2000 era photos and found that, like I said, a lot of these ravines are not getting longer and wider. So that's a good thing. Continuing on down the list, inline ditch treatment. Dr. Sands talked a little bit about that in terms of the two-stage ditches. Or I wonder about check dams and ditches or ways to slow the water in ditches, but you have to keep it coming off the land. Water storage and infiltration, as we talked about this morning, about slowing water or infiltrating it. And then certainly the last one here, channel stability and rehabilitating the bluffs. So that's kind of the list of the BMPs, and I'll just mention a little bit about the horizontal bars. So the first two here, I think crop residue and stormwater practices are practices that we've known for a long time as a society. And the green bar here means that full-scale implementation can keep going like it has in the past. And as a matter of fact, a number of communities are required to put in stormwater practices to store water and infiltrate it. And then perennial vegetation at the watershed mouths and ravine BMPs, things that might take a little groundwork. By groundwork, I mean research or maybe prioritization. Since I just said that the ravines don't seem to be all contributing, it wouldn't do much good to try to fix them all because they're not all adding sediment to the Minnesota River. So if there are some ravines to fix, then can we take some time to figure that out, to prioritize, to target, and those sorts of things. And then, of course, the inline ditch treatment, water storage, and channel stability, things I don't think that, at least I don't have the answers for at this point, and I think maybe the research community is working on that. I don't mean to say that we should wait to implement any of these things, and I also don't mean to say that nobody's doing anything on them. I just think it'll take a little more work to figure some of this out. And so that's what this maroon bar here means. It's, like I said, some groundwork. And then, of course, the yellow bar on the right means continued implementation, realizing this is going to take a while just because we need to think about this, do some research, and then figure out how we get it on the landscape. And that's something that probably will take years because it's not like we can just flip a switch or expect people to adopt these practices right away. So what do I hope comes out of this Minnesota River water quality project? Well, for agriculture, I hope it's voluntary strategies to target areas that contribute high levels of sediment and flow, using incentives and better research to help target priority areas. And that's something that I kept hearing out of the stakeholder group that meant is that as a society, we've got to do a better job of prioritization and targeting. As we've heard today, multiple studies have been funded by agriculture, state agencies, and other organizations. And I don't think anybody benefits if it becomes our science versus your science. I think we need a culture of mutual respect and trust so we can work through it. Along with this, I think new approaches will come. I think it's important to the farm community to be viewed as proactive and still maintaining its independence. Open lines of communication are needed with partners in the Minnesota River Basin, and I'm glad to see a lot of partners here. I see a lot of farmers as well as people representing watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts, watershed projects, clean up the river environment, and other nonprofits. And I think that's a good thing, because I think as we move ahead on this, I hope we can keep working together and have those conversations and build those relationships like they've been working on in Lake Pepin and Minnesota River friendship tours. If conflict resolution was easy, we wouldn't have conflict. And I guess I got to remember when I go home tonight and see my daughters when they're fighting. There appear to be people at opposite ends of the spectrum, at least as I look in the newspapers over the last couple of months. Opinions such as farmers are to blame, or it's all tile drainage, or activists are going to control how you farm. I think that's about blame, and I know when I get blamed, it backs me into a corner and limits my creativity. I get defensive, and I can't come up with those solutions that we've all got to think about to do this job. I don't think defensiveness helps. If we put our energy into fighting and defending, it's going to make it easier for others to influence the outcome. Creative conversations, listening to each other, and developing alternative ways to go about solutions, and getting from debate to conversation will help. Sure, we're seeing increases in flows, mean annual flows, base flows, and peak flows. I understand it's important to you to move water off the land. And I know a long time ago it was government policy to drain land. And I was reading some family history recently. I had a relative in Polk County, which is the Crookston area. He was one of the first sheriffs up there. And in an article, he was given a lot of credit for helping to drain the land. And one of the old railroad maps showed, it was called marshland or swampland, but obviously something where they needed to get water off that land. And obviously now it's very productive. The hydrology in the Minnesota River Basin has changed. And that started when Glacial Lake Agassiz drained and a torrent of water carved this wide basin, which has left this underfit Minnesota River in the bottom of the channel. And the hydrology changed when the Minnesota River Basin was settled, and it continues to change today. As we talked about this morning, it's adjusting based on water flow and other mechanisms. So I don't think the question should be how to get rid of tile or how to go back to the buffalo or how to achieve pre-settlement conditions. I don't think we should go there. I think the question should be things like, given what we know now, what are some ways to improve or temporarily store water? How can we work together in improving water quality while balancing economic and social concerns? So I think this is a slide that shows the larger community must settle on some critical balances. I don't think it's going to be the MPCA. Maybe we'll have a voice, maybe not. But when we look at these critical balances, if we're talking sediment in the Minnesota River, where are we going to target? Are we going to target uplands, or is it near channel? There's going to end up being a balance in there, one way or another. Treatment mechanism, should it be working on source reduction, so going right to those bluffs or banks or even fields, or should it be about interception and treatment someplace downstream? Stressors, should it be source reduction, or should it be hydrology? Timeline, is it readiness? Should we work where people are most ready, or where we have the most need? how about the sector? Is it the environment or the economy? There's going to be a balance, I think, in each one of these, and there's probably a bunch of these that are not on this list. But there'll be a balance in each of these areas that I think as a society will decide in the years to come. So these are some ideas that I put together on maybe work in the agriculture community or maybe work in society go next on improving the Minnesota River and improving water quality. And I think one is demonstrate how you are working to improve water quality. This map shows the conservation practices and easement programs in the Redwood Falls area. I asked a colleague at Bowser to put this together. And it's like I said, the Redwood Falls area. It just shows the different practices. And I guess until I see some of these on a map, it's hard to imagine what's out there. I mean, sure, you know what's on your land, but not being familiar with the day-to-day work that goes on out there, it's kind of hard for me, and I think others to relate on what's actually happening. Bowser tracks a lot of information in their E-Link database, and those are practices where federal or state money has been spent, but it doesn't include any of the voluntary practices that you've put in to improve water quality. So that doesn't show up in here. The Minnesota State University has done some reports in recent years that I think has gotten to some of that in terms of some of that tracking. So this is just one idea of mine that you might consider on tracking this on a watershed basis, or even just going to Bowser and asking for this information periodically. So when people wonder, well, what's out there on the land, maybe you've got something to show them. Another idea is maybe supporting calls for enforcing existing laws, or getting more research with Discovery Farms. Maybe it's about targeting priority areas, keeping that research going. Like I said earlier, we've got a lot of studies that have been funded, and the MPCA is not the only one studying or funding them. It's the Department of Ag and the soybean growers and the corn growers. People are interested in that information. Working with support networks, people at the local level that are around to help on whether it's NRCS or SWCDs or watershed districts or crop consultants. Then continue to show up like you're doing today. I left these bottom two bullets blank because these are my ideas. In order to get this solved, we got to come up with your ideas and others to figure this out. And it's not just, I don't think, one person that can figure this complex situation out. At the MPCA, we believe that agriculture and water quality can coexist. In my opinion, agriculture needs to demonstrate these voluntary practices and be accountable for their implementation, so people leave it voluntary. I think drainage can be multi-purpose, meeting the needs for draining land and public benefits such as water quality and habitat. If we put our energy in working together, compromising, and designing solutions that farmers can work with, you can control your own destiny. So thanks.